Wind swept across the red mesas like the breath of something ancient and cruel. The sun hadn't even climbed yet, but the townsfolk had. They gathered below Gallows Hill, clutching shawls and judgment. Dust swirled around boots and skirts, carrying the smell of iron and old wood, the kind used too many times for hangings. At the center stood a young woman, wrists bound in rope, still dark from the last condemned man. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, her cheeks swollen, but her eyes, they weren't broken yet. The sheriff said her name was Eleanor Cross, though most just called her the witch girl from the valley. They said she poisoned the McCullen cattle with herbs, said she whispered to coyotes, said she bewitched the rancher's boy, the one who rode into the storm and never came back. Truth was simpler, as truth often is. She'd been seen kneeling by the creek with her hands red from blood, though that blood had belonged to a lamb she'd been trying to save, not a curse she was casting. But nobody wanted the truth. They wanted order. They wanted someone to blame before the sun rose. The sheriff cleared his throat, hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "Eleanor Cross," he read, "for witchery, deceit, and the death of Thomas McCullen, you are hereby—" "Wait!" The word came from the back of the crowd, quiet, like a prayer, but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. A man stepped forward, tall, with a gray beard and eyes like rain over dust. His coat hung heavy, the color of dried mud. His boots were scarred from years on the range, and the star on his chest had long ago been stripped off. "Let her speak," he said. It was Jonas Hale, the rancher who'd once owned half the valley and lost all of it, along with his wife and daughter, to fever and drought. Folks said he hadn't spoken to God or man in 3 years. The sheriff spat. "Ain't your concern, Hale. You lost your say when you stopped running cattle." "Still got my land," Jonas said softly. "And I know this girl." The crowd shifted uneasily. Eleanor lifted her head. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. "No, sir," she said. "You don't." Jonas looked at her long and strange, as though seeing something from the past crawl back through time and dirt. The sheriff motioned to the hangman. "Get it done." Eleanor's breath hitched as the rope brushed her neck. She turned her face to the crowd, and though fear trembled through her bones, her voice was clear as church bell glass. "If you hang me," she said, "you'll never bury what you've done." The hangman's hand froze mid-knot. A child in the front, a boy with a torn hat, whispered, "Pa, she don't look wicked." The crowd hushed. Somewhere, a horse neighed. The wind changed. Jonas stepped forward again, his hand on his holster. "Take that rope off," he said. The sheriff hesitated. "She's condemned." "Then I'll be condemned with her," Jonas said, and his voice didn't shake. No one moved for a long time. Then the hangman sighed, loosened the rope, and Eleanor fell to her knees in the dust. The crowd began to scatter, muttering, uncertain now, not because they believed her innocent, but because a man like Jonas Hale had chosen to stand beside her. When the last boot step faded, Jonas offered his hand. "Come on," he said. "We best get gone before they remember they've still got torches." Eleanor stared at his hand, big, scarred, still calloused from work. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes hollow. "Because once, someone should have done the same for my daughter." The wind carried the sound of bells from the town below. Or maybe it was just the rope, creaking in the empty air. The town shrank behind them, swallowed by the rising dust and the first bite of dawn. Jonas rode ahead, his old gelding snorting steam into the chill air, while Eleanor sat slumped on a mule he'd borrowed from a livery that wouldn't miss it till noon. Her wrists were raw from the rope. Each hoofbeat thudded through her bones, like the echo of a verdict not yet lifted. The land stretched wide, mesas bleeding into open plains, red clay giving way to brush and rock. No sound but the distant cry of hawks and the slow creak of saddle leather. Jonas didn't speak for near an hour. When he finally did, his voice was dry as driftwood. "Name's Hale. You already know that. You can keep yours if you like, or make a new one. Don't matter to me." Eleanor didn't answer. The wind burned her eyes and lips. She hadn't slept in 2 days, hadn't eaten in one. Jonas glanced over. "You ride like you've done it before." "Wasn't always tied to a post," she said, voice brittle. "My father taught me when we came west. He died crossing the Salt Fork." Jonas nodded, eyes fixed ahead. "Most do." The silence settled again, heavy and strange. Not cruel, just tired. When they stopped at a dry creek bed to water the animals, Jonas built a small fire from sagebrush. The smoke smelled sharp and bitter. He handed her a piece of hardtack and a tin cup half full of coffee. "Eat," he said. "You'll need the strength. Folks out here don't forgive easy, and they don't forget at all." She stared into the cup, watching the surface tremble. "They said I was a witch," she murmured. "Said I cursed a man's cattle. I only mixed herbs for fever." Jonas poked the fire with a stick. "I know." She looked up. "How could you?" He didn't meet her gaze. "Because my wife knew the same herbs. Helped half this county once. Then one winter, the preacher's boy took sick, and she couldn't save him. Folks turned on her, too." Eleanor's throat tightened. "What happened?" "She died trying to leave," Jonas said. "Blizzard caught her halfway up the ridge. Took our daughter with her." He didn't say the rest, but it sat there between them, heavy as the mountain itself. Eleanor swallowed hard. "And you think saving me will even that ledger?" Jonas shook his head. "Ain't no evening a ledger like that. But maybe it's something that keeps the fire from going out entirely." They rode until the sun sank low, painting the cliffs like burning coals. As night fell, they found shelter in the hollow of a canyon, the bones of an old trading post half buried in sand. Jonas unsaddled the horses, moving with slow, deliberate motions. Eleanor watched him in the fading light. His hands were steady, but his eyes kept flicking towards her, like a man fighting ghosts. When he laid down his bedroll, she whispered, "You said you knew me." He hesitated. "Didn't say that." "You said you knew who I was." Jonas sighed, rubbed his temples. "Thought I did. My daughter, she'd be about your age now, if she'd lived. She had your same eyes, same scar on her cheek from falling off a fence when she was 10. Eleanor's breath caught. She reached up, touching the faint white mark that traced her left cheekbone. Jonas's voice broke low. "You see why I couldn't let 'em hang you?" Eleanor stared at him through the dim firelight. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, "what if you're right?" The night swallowed his answer. Only the crack of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote broke the silence. When sleep finally came, Eleanor dreamt of a cabin door slamming in a snowstorm, and a small hand reaching back through the blinding white, a hand that felt like hers. And somewhere beyond that dream, Jonas Hale sat awake, staring into the dying coals, wondering if mercy could ever undo what memory refused to release. By the time they reached the Hale place, the world had gone from red to gray, the color of dust after too many seasons without rain. The ranch sat low against the foothills, more bones than house now. The barn leaned sideways, roof half caved. The corral was nothing but broken rails and sagebrush, reclaiming what men had forced. Only the wind still remembered the cattle once lowing in the fields. Jonas dismounted and tied his horse to a post that looked like it might fall from the weight of memory, alone. Eleanor sat still in the saddle, staring at the house. "You live here alone?" "Only when I can't stand being somewhere else," he said. "You can come in, if you ain't afraid of ghosts." She followed him inside. The door creaked like a voice remembering its purpose. Inside was dust, everywhere. Dust on the table, on the picture frames, on the Bible still open to a page that hadn't been turned in years. The air smelled of cedar and rain that never came. Eleanor's eyes landed on a small rocking horse near the cold hearth, paint peeling, one eye gone. She knelt and brushed a finger over it. She played with this? Jonas nodded once. Every morning, till the fever took her. He looked out the window, jaw tightening. "Town said it was God's will. I said God had nothing to do with it." Eleanor turned, voice soft. "So you buried her here?" "Up on the ridge, next to her ma." He poured 2 tin cups of water, slid one her way. "You can stay a while. I'll mend the barn roof, and well, you'll do what you can. Keep busy. Keeps the thoughts from growing teeth." She nodded slowly. "I can sew, cook, mend clothes, but they'll come looking for me, Jonas." "I reckon they will," he said. "But this land's older than their anger. They'll forget soon enough, or turn on someone else." He paused, looking at her again, longer this time. "You remind me too much of her, girl. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it don't." Eleanor glanced toward the wall. There hung a small framed drawing, faded almost white. A child's sketch, a house, a stick figure man, and a little girl with long hair standing beside him. In the corner, barely legible, the name Nora Hale. Eleanor whispered it. The name hung in the air like a ghost sighing. Jonas didn't stop her, didn't tell her to leave it alone. That night she slept by the hearth, wrapped in an old blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and horse sweat. Outside, the coyotes howled again, and wind rattled through the cracks in the window. But it wasn't just the wind that woke her near midnight. It was a sound like slow boots across dry boards. She sat up, heart hammering, eyes searching the dark. In the doorway stood Jonas, a lantern in his hand. His face looked carved from stone and grief. "You shouldn't walk the house at night," he said softly. "This place remembers too much." "I wasn't walking," she whispered. "I thought you were." He frowned. "Wasn't me." For a long moment neither spoke. Then a faint creak came from the back room, the one Jonas hadn't opened since she arrived. He raised the lantern. Dust motes swirled like tiny ghosts in the light. When he finally pushed the door open, the air inside was heavy, cold. A small bed stood against the far wall, still made, a child's dress folded neatly on the chair beside it. Above the bed, carved into the headboard, were 3 letters scratched by small hands. E-L-A. Eleanor reached out, tracing them with her finger. "That's my daughter's middle name," Jonas murmured. "Elaine." Her hand trembled. "That's my middle name, too." Jonas turned toward her then, eyes wide, something like fear flickering in them, or recognition too deep for words. The lamp shook slightly in his hand, throwing wild shadows across the walls. "Tell me," he said quietly, "who was your father?" Eleanor swallowed, voice thin. "He said my mother died on a journey." He never told me where from, only that we came from west of the ridge, and that I should never go near the valley with the burned ranch. Jonas stood frozen. Then he took one step back, his face gone pale as the moonlight. "Good Lord," he breathed. You can't be—" But the words wouldn't come. The wind outside rose to a hollow wail, slamming the door against the wall. Eleanor's voice shook as she whispered, "I am the daughter you lost, Jonas Hale." The lantern sputtered out, a darkness fell. And in that darkness something changed. Not forgiveness yet, but the first sound of it stirring, like old timbers shifting under the weight of long-buried truth. The dawn came pale and nervous, light slanting through cracked windows, as if afraid to touch what the night had uncovered. Jonas Hale sat by the table, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The coffee pot hissed faintly over the embers, but he hadn't poured a drop. Eleanor stood near the window, wrapped in her shawl, her hair tangled and her eyes hollow. Between them stretched silence, thick as the dust in the air. When he finally spoke, Jonas's voice was quieter than the wind through the grass. "Say it again." She turned slowly. "You had a wife named Clara and a daughter named Elaine. She was 8 when the fever came. She had a small white scar here," she touched her cheekbone, "from falling off a fence. You buried them both on the ridge." Jonas looked up, his face a storm of disbelief and desperate hope. "I buried 2 bodies. I dug with my own hands till they bled. You telling me?" "I don't know," Eleanor whispered, "but my father always said we were running from ghosts, and that my mother never survived the mountain storm." Jonas's voice roughened. "Show me." He stood abruptly, grabbed his hat, and walked out into the morning. The air smelled of cold dirt and sage. Eleanor followed, heart pounding like a drum in her throat. They climbed the ridge behind the ranch. The path was narrow, carved by rain and hoofprint. At the top, the world opened, wind sweeping through the dry grass, the valley spread wide and endless. Jonas stopped by 2 small crosses leaning in the earth. The wood was sun-bleached, initials carved in the grain, CH and EH. He knelt. His hand trembled as he brushed away years of dust. "I buried her here," he said hoarsely. "Both of them. Clara in her shawl, Elaine in her mother's arms. There wasn't no mistaking." Eleanor knelt beside him. "Maybe there was," she whispered. "Maybe she lived long enough for someone to find her." Jonas looked up sharply. "And take her? Why?" She shook her head. "Because maybe God wasn't finished with your sorrow yet." The wind shifted. A corner of the smaller grave's mound crumbled, revealing something pale beneath the dirt, bone or cloth. Jonas leaned in, hands trembling as he brushed it clean. It wasn't bone. It was a locket, rusted, but still holding the faint outline of an engraving, a child's name scratched by a father's hand. He opened it with a thumb calloused from years of hard mercy. Inside was a curl of dark hair, brittle but real, the same color as Eleanor's. He turned toward her. "Where'd you get your locket, girl?" Eleanor reached under her blouse and pulled out a small silver chain. The locket that hung from it was broken in half, jagged, as if torn apart once. The piece Jonas held fit perfectly into its edge. He didn't speak, didn't move. Only the wind spoke now, moving through the tall grass like a hymn. Eleanor's voice cracked. "My father said it was from before I could walk. He said my real home burned. He said my mother died. He never said from who." Jonas stared at her as the truth set like iron. His eyes, old and beaten, filled slowly with tears, he hadn't thought possible anymore. He rose to his feet, unsteady. "Then the man who raised you wasn't my father," she finished. "He found me after the storm." Jonas turned toward the valley, where the wind ran wild across the plains. "All this time," he whispered, "you were alive." Eleanor looked at the grave. "And all this time, I thought I was born under a curse." He turned to her then, the faintest tremor breaking through his composure. "I thought the curse was mine." For a long moment, the two of them stood, not touching, not daring, just breathing the same raw, hollow air that had once carried their loss apart. Then Jonas took off his hat and placed it against his chest. "I can't ask forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I can give you a name back if you'll take it." Eleanor's eyes shimmered. "Names don't heal, Jonas, but maybe they remind you where the pain began." He nodded, voice thick. "Then maybe that's enough." As they turned to leave, the wind picked up again, carrying dust and faint petals from a lone wildflower clinging to the ridge, one that shouldn't have been able to grow in that soil, yet did. Jonas paused, kneeling to touch it. "Clara planted seeds here," he murmured. "Said she wanted beauty to outlast pain." Eleanor knelt beside him, brushing the tiny bloom with her fingertip. "Looks like one made it." Jonas's hand closed over hers, rough, old, trembling. "Maybe we did, too." Below, the land stretched quiet and wide. And though nothing had changed, the valley somehow looked less like a wound, more like a beginning. Evening crept across the valley like spilled ink, bleeding over the dry land. Eleanor and Jonas rode back down in silence, the old ranch coming into view as a black silhouette against the sinking sun. Smoke from the small cook fire Jonas had left burning drifted upward, thin as memory. When they reached the yard, Jonas swung down from his horse and moved stiffly toward the barn. He still hadn't spoken much since the ridge. His silence wasn't cold. It was the kind that comes from too many words piled up behind a dam that can't afford to break. Eleanor tethered her mule, then caught sight of something coiled on the fence post, the same rope that had nearly ended her life. Jonas had used it earlier to tie down a tarp, but seeing it now, still rough, still stained from that morning, sent a shiver through her spine. She picked it up. The fibers were stiff, frayed at the knot. She ran her fingers over it until she felt the burn on her own wrists ache again. Jonas appeared behind her. "You don't need to keep looking at that." Eleanor turned slowly. "It's a part of me now." He nodded, eyes weary. "So's the scar on your cheek, and the one on mine. But they don't own us." Her voice was low, fragile. "Maybe not, but they remember us." She dropped the rope into the dirt, staring at it. "This rope was meant to erase me," she said. "I think it deserves an ending, too." Jonas hesitated, then handed her a match from his coat pocket. "Then give it one." The flame hissed to life, small but alive, flickering in the dusk wind. Eleanor crouched, holding it to the rope. The fire crawled up the fibers, slow and hungry, until the smoke turned dark and bitter. The smell filled the air, tar, hemp, sweat, and a hint of something older, something like deliverance. Jonas stood beside her, his shadow long and solemn against the ground. "Funny thing about burning," he murmured. "You never really know what you're destroying, or what you're setting free." She watched the last threads crumble into ash. "Maybe both," she whispered. When the flame died, she scooped a handful of the warm ashes and let them fall through her fingers, slow as prayer. The wind caught them, carrying the remains east, toward the ridge, toward the graves, toward memory. Jonas cleared his throat. "There's something I ought to show you." He led her into the barn, where the air smelled of hay and iron. In the corner stood an old chest, its hinges rusted, lid half covered in dust. He opened it carefully, pulling out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, the pages yellowed, edges chewed by time. "This was Clara's," he said. "She kept notes on every healing she did, who she helped, what she used, even what the town said about her." Eleanor turned a page, fingers trembling. There, in Clara's looping handwriting, was an entry dated March 4th, 1866. "Little E has fever again. Storm coming. If I can't make it back, Jonas will know what to do." Eleanor traced the ink with a fingertip. "She knew," she whispered. "She must have known she might not come home." Jonas nodded slowly. "She always knew more than I did." He leaned against the post, voice thick with dust and regret. "When I buried those graves, I couldn't bring myself to open the blanket. Couldn't face it. I just assumed." Eleanor looked up at him. "We both been living on assumptions, Jonas. You assumed I was gone. I assumed I wasn't worth saving." He managed a faint, tired smile. "Maybe that's why the good Lord threw us back, together, to make fools out of both." They stood there for a while, surrounded by the creak of old wood and the smell of smoke drifting in from outside. Then softly, Eleanor said, "Tomorrow, I'll go into town. I'll face them." Jonas straightened sharply. "They'll turn on you again." "I know, but I can't keep hiding in a ghost house. I want them to see I ain't what they made me." He stared at her, then nodded once. "If you're going, I'll go with you." Eleanor shook her head. "They need to see me alone first. You've already carried enough shame for one lifetime." Jonas's jaw tightened. Ain't shame to stand for the truth. She looked him in the eyes, really looked, and saw the years of loss there, the quiet storms that had shaped him. "Then let's stand together," she said softly. He gave a small nod, the kind men give when words are too fragile to trust. Outside, the last light of day broke over the valley, catching the drifting ashes of the rope as they scattered into the wind, tiny sparks fading into night. The mark that once condemned her was gone. But the burn it left, on her skin, on his soul, glowed faintly still, like a warning and a promise both. Morning came sharp and colorless, the kind that makes the world look scraped clean, but only on the surface. Jonas saddled his horse, while Eleanor packed what little she had into a worn satchel. The half-locket, Clara's book, and a small scrap of the rope she'd kept unburned, tied around her wrist not as a mark of shame, but memory. Neither spoke much as they rode toward town. The trail stretched long and lonely, the kind that makes a person think too hard. The air smelled of frost and smoke, someone burning brush down by the river. When the rooftops of Dry Creek appeared, the silence thickened. The same town that had gathered to hang her now dozed beneath morning dust, pretending at peace. Jonas slowed his horse. "You don't have to do this." Eleanor's eyes stayed fixed ahead. "I do. They have to see I lived, that the rope didn't finish me." He nodded once, jaw set. "Then I'll ride beside you. If they aim to look at you, they'll have to look at me too." She didn't argue. They entered the town side by side, hooves echoing down Main Street, like judgment come home to roost. Men stopped sweeping porches. Women froze mid-step, holding pails, mouths tight. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. The preacher's wife made the sign of the cross. Eleanor dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate, not proud, not defiant, just alive. Her boots touched the dirt where her knees had hit the morning they'd meant to hang her. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and old fear. Jonas climbed down too, but kept a few paces back. This was her fight. She faced the crowd gathering around the well. "You all know me," she said, her voice low but steady. "You said I cursed your land, your cattle, your sons. You said I wasn't fit to draw the same breath as you." Someone spat in the dirt. Another muttered, "She's supposed to be dead." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "I nearly was. But I came back to show you what your fear made you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sheriff McAllen stepped forward, hand on his belt buckle, eyes narrow. "You shouldn't have come back, girl. Some things don't need stirring." Jonas took a step forward, voice low and dangerous. "That what you said when you tied the rope, Sheriff?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Eleanor held up the torn rope fragment around her wrist. "You see this?" she said. "This was meant to erase me, to make you forget what you did. But I'll wear it till the day I die, not as your shame, but as your truth." The blacksmith's wife, a broad woman with soot on her face, spoke up. "We done what the preacher said was right. You can't blame folk for fear." Eleanor looked at her, not with hate, but with the kind of sadness that cuts deeper than any weapon. "Fear's one thing, but you cheered when they put the noose round my neck." The woman looked away, and then from the edge of the crowd, a small voice piped up, high, trembling, honest, a child. The same boy who'd whispered that morning on Gallows Hill. "She ain't wicked," he said. "She saved our calf last spring. I seen her do it." All eyes turned. The boy's father tried to hush him, but the sound was already out. A tiny, fragile crack in the dam of silence. Jonas's breath caught. Eleanor's hand went to her heart. The sheriff scowled. "That's enough." "No," said Jonas. "It ain't." He stepped beside Eleanor, planting his boots in the same dirt that had once condemned her. "You all talk of sin and justice, but I buried my family on that ridge because of the same kind of fear. You reckon that's the Lord's will?" No one answered. Wind stirred the dust. Eleanor's voice softened. "I don't want your pity. I don't even need your forgiveness. I just want you to remember that mercy's heavier than hate, and that a rope only tightens if you let it." Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out Clara Hale's book. "Your wives came to my mother once," she said, "for fever, for birth pains, for herbs that saved their lives. This is her record. Page after page of names she helped, the same families who turned on me." She handed it to the preacher's wife. "Maybe read it before you call another woman a curse." The woman's hands shook as she took the book. Jonas stepped closer, voice firm but gentle. "You've all been burying ghosts you never faced. I found mine, and she's standing right here. Maybe it's time you face yours." The silence broke in a strange way. Not shouting, not violence, but a slow scattering of people. Some ashamed, some thoughtful, some just afraid to stay. When the dust settled, only the preacher's wife and the boy remained. The woman looked up at Eleanor, eyes damp. "You gonna stay in town?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, but I'll come back when the land's ready for planting. There's healing to be done, for more than me." The woman nodded once, slowly. "Then I'll keep the book till then." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Keep it safe. It's proof that not all things born in dirt have to stay buried." Jonas touched her shoulder lightly. Come on, girl. Let's go home. As they rode out, the sun climbed high enough to catch the ash on Eleanor's wrist rope, glinting like tiny flecks of gold. Behind them, the town stayed quiet. But something unseen had shifted. A weight lifted, just slightly, as if the valley itself had drawn its first true breath in years. Weeks passed. The world went on turning, quiet and slow, as if the valley itself were relearning how to breathe. Eleanor stayed at the Hale Ranch, tending the land that had once been her family's, and now was again, not through blood, but through endurance. Each morning she rose before the sun, lighting the hearth and sweeping the dust that never seemed to end. She mended fences, stitched old curtains, planted seeds in the hard soil near the ridge, where 2 crosses still stood. Jonas mended the barn roof, one nail at a time, though his hands shook more than they used to. The days carried no miracles, only work, silence, and a growing steadiness between them. Sometimes they talked, not about the town, not about the rope, not about the years stolen, but small things. The feel of the wind before rain, the way horses dream, the smell of burned coffee. It was enough. At night, they'd sit by the fire. Jonas would stare into the flames, voice low and almost tender. "When I lost them, I stopped talking to God," he said one evening. "Didn't seem fair to speak into silence." Eleanor looked at the coals. "Maybe God don't live in churches," she said softly. "Maybe he lives in what's left after we've been broken." Jonas nodded slowly. "Maybe so." Outside, thunder murmured in the distance, faint, uncertain, but real. The next day, clouds gathered thick and black over the hills. The wind smelled of copper and sage, and the sky rumbled like an old promise being remembered. Jonas stood on the porch, hat in hand, eyes lifted. "Been years since the sky looked that heavy." Eleanor stepped beside him. "You think it'll pass us by?" "Not this time," he said. "Storm's coming for us proper." When the first drops hit the dry dust, they didn't soak in right away. They sizzled, like the earth didn't trust them. Then came the downpour, wild, cold, cleansing. Eleanor laughed, actually laughed, as she ran into the yard, letting the rain wash over her face, her hair, her scar. The rope fragment on her wrist turned dark again, its ashes bleeding into the soil. Jonas watched her for a moment before stepping out too, slow and unsure, until the water streamed down his face like tears he didn't need to hide anymore. They stood there, 2 broken pieces of the same story, finally caught in the same storm that once tore them apart. When the thunder eased, the air smelled of life again, wet earth, horses, wild flowers already daring to rise. Eleanor knelt by the patch she'd planted weeks before. Tiny green shoots were pushing through the mud, trembling but alive. Jonas knelt beside her, his old hands brushing the new growth. "Didn't think this ground could bloom again," he said quietly. She looked at him, rain still dripping from her lashes. "Maybe it just needed forgiveness." He nodded slowly, a tired smile ghosting his lips. "Ain't easy, digging that deep." Eleanor pressed her palm against the soil. "Neither is staying buried." That night, the ranch smelled of wet wood and fresh wind. The fire crackled low. Jonas poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her. "I used to think I was waiting for death," he said. "Turns out I was waiting for you." Eleanor looked into the flames. "I wasn't sent to save you, Jonas. I just came back to remind you we were both worth saving." He chuckled softly. "Maybe that's the same thing." Outside, rain still whispered against the windows, softer now, a lullaby for land and bone alike. When she finally went to bed, Eleanor looked once more at the ridge through the open door, the two crosses glinting faintly under the moonlight, and beside them the faint outline of new blossoms swaying in the breeze. The world hadn't forgiven everything, but it had started to remember how. Morning broke soft and silver, the kind of light that doesn't demand anything, just arrives gentle over the land. Mist hung low across the valley, wrapping the fences and the hills in a kind of mercy. The air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke, and for the first time in years, the sound of running water came from the creek that had long been dry. Jonas Hale sat on the porch steps, a blanket around his shoulders, watching the world wake. He could hear the faint hum of Eleanor's voice from the barn, low, tuneless, but steady. It was the sound of a person who'd stopped asking for the world's permission to live. When she came out, her sleeves were rolled, hair damp, boots splattered with mud. "2 calves born last night," she said with a tired smile. "Both standin' already." Jonas chuckled softly. "Stubborn blood. Must run in the family." She smiled back, quiet and warm. "Guess it does." They ate breakfast without hurry. Cornbread, coffee, rainwater boiled clean. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't the kind that hid pain anymore. It was the kind that let it rest. Afterward, Eleanor walked up the ridge alone. The path was slick with dew, the air thick with the smell of new earth. When she reached the graves, she knelt, not in mourning, but in peace. Tiny wildflowers had bloomed where the storm had passed, blue and yellow, fragile and bright. Between the 2 crosses she placed a small stone she'd found by the creek, smooth, river-worn, shaped almost like a heart. "This is for the ones who were lost," she whispered, "and the ones who came back different." She closed her eyes, listening to the wind. It didn't wail anymore. It sang, faint and full of distance, like something mended, but still remembering where it tore. When she stood to leave, she noticed something half buried in the soil near the flowers. A piece of weathered wood, carved faintly with the letters ELA. She smiled, touched it once, then covered it again with earth. "Rest easy now," she said. "I'll take it from here." Back at the house, Jonas was fixing the porch rail. Slow, patient work. His hands shook a little, but they were sure. He looked up when she approached. "Good ground up there." "The best," she said. "They're at peace." He nodded, setting the hammer aside. "So what now, girl? You plannin' to keep on here?" Eleanor looked out over the fields, the green starting to return where brown had ruled for years. "I'll stay a while. The land's still healin', and maybe I am too." Jonas smiled, faint and rough. "You remind me of your Mother Moore each day. She had that same way of making broken things keep breathin'." Eleanor reached into her satchel and took out the silver locket. The 2 halves now joined again, gleaming faintly in the light. She placed it in his palm. "It belonged to both of you," she said. "Now it belongs to the land." He stared at it a long time, then stood and walked to the edge of the porch. With a small, steady motion, he dropped it into the wet earth beside the steps, where new grass was pushing through. "Let it root where it should have always been," he said. Eleanor's eyes softened. "You sure you want to let it go?" He looked at her, his face a map of years, sorrow, and the faintest thread of peace. "Child," he said, "letting go's the only way I ever got to hold on to anything." The day warmed, the mist lifted, birds returned to the cottonwoods. Life, small and unremarkable, began to hum again. As the sun climbed, Eleanor walked down to the field with a spade and a basket of seeds. Jonas followed, slower now, but smiling. She pressed her hands into the dirt, feeling its damp weight between her fingers. The same earth that once tried to bury her now cradling her gently. When she looked up, Jonas was watching, eyes bright against the light. "What you thinking?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "That maybe this is what survival really is. Not starting over, just starting again." He nodded. "That's enough." They worked side by side until the sun dropped low again, and shadows stretched across the field like long-forgotten prayers. When the day finally ended, and the first stars appeared above the ridge, Eleanor sat on the porch steps, the place where she'd once stood in fear, now a place of stillness. Her wrists still bore faint marks of the rope, her cheek still carried its scar. But now they were only reminders, proof of what she'd walked through, not what she was bound to. Jonas came out, easing himself into the chair beside her. Neither spoke for a long time. Then quietly, she said, "Do you ever think folks'll remember us different?" He considered it. Maybe. Maybe not. But stories got a way of changin' the longer they're told. Maybe someday they'll tell yours around a fire, and it'll make someone else believe they can walk away from the rope, too. She smiled. That's enough for me. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of new rain and distant wildflowers. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rumbled again. Not a warning this time, but a heartbeat. And as the night settled over the valley, the last thing visible in the fading light was a small patch of wildflowers growing near the porch, their petals the color of forgiveness. They say mercy doesn't change the past, only how it breathes inside you. And maybe that's all a person can ask for, in a land that buries the gentle and remembers the cruel. To leave behind one patch of earth where something soft can grow, and to remind whoever finds it that survival, quiet and unremarkable, is still a kind of victory.